What's up, painting friends? It's Stoof here. Welcome back to my channel. I've had a request for lily pad painting tutorials, so that's what we're going to do today. I have my own reference photo from a lily pad I saw in a state park out on the eastern side of Pennsylvania. There's a nice reflection of some of the forest in the water, and then we have our lily pads kind of scattered along the scene. So we have an 11-inch by 14-inch canvas panel. I did a couple extra layers of gesso on here to try to bring that texture of the canvas down a bit. And then we're using acrylic paints today. I have a mixture of brands and types of acrylic paint, but we got all the colors I'm going to need. I have burnt sienna, light green, vivid lime green, phthalo green, yellow azo, ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow deep. Actually, it might be cadmium yellow medium. This one is raw sienna. It's like an ochre type of color if you have that. This one is sap green. This one azurite blue, dioxazine purple. This is a deep magenta. This one's called Titan buff. It's like a beige color, creamy color. This one is light magenta. This is medium magenta. This is burnt umber, Mars black, titanium white, and crimson. Alright, we're going to start with my number 4 flat tip brush that's a little frayed. Just dip it in the water, and the first thing I'm going to do is just take some ultramarine blue, really thin that down, and start to sketch out where I'm going to have some lily pads. So just doing like the oval shapes for where my lily pads will be, and I also want to put a little dot in the center just so I know where center approximately is on the canvas. Might be more like there, but somewhere in there. Just focusing on the general shape of the lily pads right now, not getting any details in here just yet. And also wherever I have some flowers, I'm just putting a little like spiky round thing there. Some of these lily pads are under the water. Some have just some resting water on them. Some are totally like out of the water with just a little bit of puddle on them. So we're gonna get a lot of color variation and value variation from those changes based on like how much water is on the lily. Alright, so now we have the lily pads sketched out. We know where those are. What I'm going to start with is the reflection in the water, which is pretty dark green, brown, purple, blue color in general. And then there's some light reflecting through the trees too that we'll get in this reflection. And then we will start to add all of the colors and values in actual lily pads. Because I'm using acrylic paint, this will dry quickly and I can work a little more quickly. I would prefer to do this painting in oils, but that will take me a couple weeks because there's going to be a lot of layering happening. So I just wanted to show you this tutorial using acrylic paint so that we can get to the finish line faster and show you the process without it dragging out over a month. I'm starting by blending some ultramarine blue with sap green and azurite blue. I'm also going to blend in some white and some black, more azurite, sap green, phthalo green, and that's a good base for some of these spots. So I'm going to start filling in this color on the canvas. I want to make sure I'm covering up all this white space. And I'm just looking at places, put this back there. Right now I'm just looking at places in my reference photo where we have this general color and value, and I'm blocking this in those spots, going around the lily pads, not covering them up too much. You can cover them up a little bit on your sketch mark area, but I wouldn't go too extreme with that. And we're going to mix a little magenta in here too. This helps to darken it and make it a little more of a neutral green. Might make things a little easier or look a little smoother if you just keep your brush strokes in general back and forth this way, not like all over the place like I was doing down here. If you have a lot of space where you don't have to work in between little lily pads, then you could do that, but for back here I think it's a little bit easier to just go back and forth with the brush. Just trying to get a couple of these little spaces in between the lily pads because there might not be a lot of water showing, but there still will be a shadow there, so I'm getting some of that in. Now I'm going to switch down to this number 6 flat tip brush. It's kind of frayed. And we're going to start to add some detail from the reflections in the water. So we'll start with Tighten Buff with some black. I need to get more ultramarine blue. Alright, mixing the ultramarine blue with those colors. Get some umber in here. A little more black, just a little bit. And we could start to add some of our reflections. So we've got a tree here. And it kind of splits. You can add a little more black. So I'm just following the limb from the tree branch here. Down. To where we can see it in the reflection. And I'm just kind of fluffing out the edges so it's not super sharp on the edges, because this is a reflection. It's not going to be super sharp, perfect image. It's going to be a little hazy. Mixing a little more ultramarine and black so I can kind of fade that edge out there. Start to show like some bark. And we'll mix in some phthalo with our Doxazine purple and some sap green and some ultramarine blue, like a nice dark color. And I just want to darken this up on this side of the tree. And a little azurite. We'll tighten maybe too. And maybe a little bit of black, because it's not super bright. That'll work. And then we've got, let's do a little more ultramarine. And we've got some of these spots in the water here. This is where the light is reflecting through the trees. So we're just taking the brush and kind of pushing it around, adding these little spots where the sky breaking through the trees, like the visible parts of the sky, are reflecting on the water. Okay, and then we can take some Titan with our vivid lime green and sap green and yellow azo. Let's also do some more sap green. Then we gotta cool it down, so let's take some azurite and ultramarine and make it a little less saturated with this Titan color. I'm just gonna dip that in the water, and this is what we're gonna do here. So we're just gonna like very lightly press and just drag the brush around very gently and like kind of pushing it in diagonal ways, and that's how we're gonna get these little leaves on the branches. I'm going to add some highlights on these. Now that that's drying, I can see it needs a little more. Same over here. Take a little bit more white, and I'll take a little bit of this yellow. Take a little more azo too. Just add some highlights in here again. Basically it for that color. Now we need some phthalo green with white and cadmium yellow. And some magenta. Let's do a little vivid lime green. And that's looking pretty good for some of these. Let's do a little more white and a tiny bit of purple. That's good. Yeah. So they have all these lily pads have lots of different little colors in them. So we gotta start with one base color for this. Get the shape. And then add all the other subtle color variations later. You don't want to leave any white space between your lily pad and the background that you just painted. And try to get a nice sharp edge for your lily pads. Also, don't make all your lily pads have like the perfect oval. They've all got little variations in the shape. I'm going to mix a little more phthalo green and magenta into here now. Maybe a little bit of this light green color too. And this one is a raw sienna with burnt sienna under there a little bit. Got some crimson with that, and purple and green for this one. Maybe a little more purple. Tiny bit of that green. Okay, and this one under here, this one's underwater, and it's just dark. Got that. And then we'll take some sap green with the color on my brush, some white, and then I'll get the top part of this lily pad. It's kind of sticking up out of the water. And then we'll take some sap green. And it's kind of on top of this other one, so we'll just put that there. And there's a reflection of it, which is just brown, with some sap green, just to fill in that white space there. Alright. And next we've got this nice light one again. Alright, that's a flower. I guess I'll just go in with the flowers real quick with some white and light magenta, and we'll do this dark deep magenta color too. We'll just start with that so we know where the flowers are. Maybe a little crimson in there too. Tiny dab of yellow. Okay, just gonna do that for now. There's another one right here. And I want to get that background darker around that. Yeah, that reflection is going to be there too. For the reflection, just to get that base in there, I just mixed some crimson with ultramarine blue and white, like in this area with the base color for the flowers. And we're going to come back and add more to that later, but that just gets us started. Got one over here. I don't know if you guys have noticed this yet, but another thing to think about with getting your lily pads accurate is the shape. changes from the lily pads here to the lily pads back here based on our perspective. So these ones are closer to us, we're looking a little bit more down on them, so we can see they're like a little bit wider this way, and the lily pads back here are more narrow. You don't see quite as much of the top of it, so our perspective changes. So make sure your lily pads back here in general are a little bit more flat compared to the ones right in the foreground. And at this point, the tutorial becomes very repetitive, so I am starting to speed up the footage a little bit, and I'll continue to talk about the process. So here I'm continuing to fill in the remainder of the lily pads in the background there with a basic color, just kind of blocking in the shapes at first. Then I start to bounce around, mixing some yellow ochre, some sap green, some cadmium yellow light, maybe a little bit of white and brown in there as well. And that yellowish color helps to show where there's some sitting water on the lily pads. So you can add that to a few of your lily pads. I also blocked in a few brown, reddish brown lily pads. Those ones are underwater or they're just darker in color. After that, I adjusted the shapes a little bit and I start bouncing around, working in different section of the pond here. Here I'm focusing on those lily pads in the right, closer to the foreground area, just tweaking the outer edge, adding a darker shadow right around the rim to show a little shadow of maybe a tiny little bit of the lily pad that's visible under there. Also starting to add some subtle variations on a lily pad with some darker green, so maybe mixing some azurite blue with sap green, a little bit of tiny bit of black in there too, and that's helping it to look like we have some water on the lily pad. You don't want to cover your entire lily pad with a solid color anymore. Now we're just starting to add highlights and shadows to the lily pads, adjusting the shapes and starting to make it look a little more three-dimensional, like we have some water sitting on there or some light reflecting, things like that. Here I'm going back to work on the flowers, the lilies, and I'm using my flat-tipped brush, number 4 or number 2 flat-tip brush would work as well here. And I'm holding the flat-tip brush at an angle so I can get the top jagged petals of the lily flowers. And once I get that nice arc shape with all the little lily petals at the top, I kind of carry that brush stroke down towards the center, but leaving the center bottom part of each flower that darker, cooler pink. You can also make some adjustments to your shadows so that they equally reflect the shape of the petals above them. And I'm going to let those lily flowers sit for a little bit while I come back to work on more of the lily pads. Now I'm working on a lily pad in the lower left in the foreground. You can see that I'm adding more sap green with some white, a little bit of umber in there, and that's making it look like the water's wet. Now I'm going around the rim and highlighting that little bit of the rim where maybe it's catching a little bit more light, or maybe it was wet but it's reflecting light on the rim there. And you can make a little section in the little line down the center of the lily pad to show where it's raised, where there's like a little crease there. We basically follow the same pattern for every lily pad. You have that base color down first, then you start to add some shadows where there might be some sitting water, and the shadows typically have more browns and darker greens, cooler greens in them. You can add highlights around the edges or in little sections in the center where there might be a crease, or any section where there's a big highlight from either a wet lily pad reflecting light or just like a part of the lily pad that's raised up out of the water. And you start to add a few more color variations in there as well. You can mix in some ochre and yellow with your green and brown to make it look like it's a little bit deeper under the water. You can add brighter little highlights along the edges of the lily pads where some water might be reflecting light and kind of just stagnant along the outer edge of the lily pad. And you just keep doing this for all of your lily pads. You don't want them all to follow the exact same color scheme. Some lily pads are going to have a little bit more purple and brown in them. Some are going to have a little more green and yellow in them. So try to make a good variety of color, and that's going to help make this painting more three-dimensional and exciting to look at. In addition to the greens, yellows, and browns I've been adding to these lily pads, I'm also adding some azurite blue with white, or maybe a little bit of purple with blue and green all combined. There's a lot of color variation going on in these lily pads. You also can, if you want to follow this same style I'm using for this painting, you can start to outline the lily pads. Make sure you get a nice good shadow under all the lily pads, especially those ones in the background that are kind of overlapping from your perspective. Make sure you have a good little shadow along the underside of each lily pad. It'll help them to stand out from one another a little more. And you can also just take some pure brown in some sections and just start to add some brown into the water, maybe a little bit of brown mixed with blue to add a deeper shadow in some spots. It'll help the lily pads to stand out even more. Here I'm going over some lily pads in the background with just some pure yellow azo. This is a translucent pigment, so it lets you see through what's under it. By adding this translucent yellow over the green, it makes it look like those lily pads in the background are wet. After getting those done, I finish up the painting by touching up the lily flowers again, and I'm just going to those last two in the background, adding the petals at the top, creating that nice arc shape. Once the arc shape is all done, I mix in just a tiny bit of my ultramarine blue with some of my portrait paint color or my light magenta, and I'm using that, maybe like a tiny hint of black too. You want it to be a little cooler than that bright white color you used for the top part, and you're just going to create more petals that are a little bit lower and a little bit wider, and that helps to create that appearance of a round petal with an opening in the center facing up. And once you get that in there, you can add a few more little shadows to the underside of the petals. You can build up that magenta if you want them to be a little bit more on the pink side, and just make sure the reflection on the underside of the flowers is accurate as well. Once the flowers are done, I just went back in on my own time and made a few more minor touch-ups to the lily pads. And here we have our completed acrylic painting. Hope you guys enjoyed watching this painting tutorial, and I hope this was helpful for you. I didn't want to carry this one out in real time because this would have taken over 5 hours to teach if I did this in real time. So I hope you still picked up something from this video. If you have any questions with painting lily pads, then just leave a comment under this video and I will try to help you as best as I can. Thanks for watching. I hope you guys have a great day and happy painting. Bye bye.